Hello, everyone, and welcome to Monbiosis. Now, I'm very excited about this edition because we've had a problem for a long time in the climate movement. It's just we just haven't been able to make it big enough. And we've quite easily been divided from some of the people we should be reaching, the world's workers, the global poor, who are all too easily persuaded by demagogues, by corporate lobby groups that we, the climate activists, have come to take your jobs away and we've come to destroy your standards of living. And that's hampered our attempts to make this into the huge global movement it needs to be. And many of us have struggled with this, but we've been aware in doing so, people like myself, in the rich nations, that we can't possibly be the leaders of such a movement which would bridge that gap. And I'm delighted to say that really just when we need it most, we are looking at what I think could easily be a breakthrough movement, led by people from the poorer nations, with a very exciting proposal for how we might unite these huge movements to create a global, dynamic climate campaign with the capacity to change the future course of events. So I'd like to introduce three of the leading lights in this new campaign called Debt for Climate. There's Sunny Morgan from South Africa, Esteban Servat from Argentina, and Louise Wagner from Germany. And I'm going to ask them all to introduce themselves in turn. So, Sunny, could you start us off by telling us something about yourself?
Thank you, George, and thanks for the invite. I'm Sunny Morgan. I'm a climate justice activist based in Johannesburg, South Africa. I'm with Extinction Rebellion South Africa and Extinction Rebellion Gauteng, the province where I live. I also participate in other movements, but my activity now is centered around Debt for Climate.
Thank you very much. Esteban, tell us about your own background.
Yes, thank you, George, for inviting us. Great to be with you. I'm Esteban. I'm from Argentina. I'm a scientist. I spent 10 years of my life working in the US, in the Silicon Valley, then went home to do a couple of projects. One of them was an environmental community project. And then fracking came to us in the Vaca Muerta region. Then we were able to leak a secret document from the government that was revealing contamination in the area. And this helped create a climate resistance movement against fracking. We created a platform called Ecoleaks, inspired by WikiLeaks. And in a very simple fashion, we leaked that information and much more. And then the persecution and death threats that followed that led me to having to flee for Germany 3 years ago. And since my time in Europe, I've been working on connecting the dots, connecting the climate movements between Global South and North, and pushing for global campaigns that can put the frontliners and the struggles of the Global South in the agenda of the climate movements in Europe.
And Louise, could you tell us something about yourself, please?
Of course, thank you. So I'm Louise. I'm originally from Luxembourg, now based in Berlin, in Germany, where I'm organized with a group that is called Ende, who is trying to fight against the extreme destruction that is perpetuated by the fossil fuel industry, and especially now by the gas industry. But likewise, we're like Sunny, my main focus at the moment is with Debt for Climate to organize on an international scale.
Thank you very much. Now, before we explain this, I think, very exciting new idea behind Debt for Climate, can we just fill people in on where we are with the issue of external debt, the poorer nations and the external debt they face? Because here in the UK in the 1990s, there was a lot of campaigning about debt, about the unfairness of poorer nations having to hand over so much of their wealth to richer nations. And then it sort of disappeared. You know, in the last 20 years, we've heard much less about it. Now, Sunny, is that because external debt for poorer nations is no longer a problem?
No, the debt remains a huge problem in the Global South, but particularly in African countries. We are burdened by an amount in South Africa. It's probably almost 200 billion US dollars. And that interest payments on the debt alone is so substantial that it affects our ability to pay better wages, to feed our people, to buy vaccines. The debt is a huge problem, and it's definitely not going away. In fact, they continue to lend unashamedly.
Yeah. And Esteban, explain how that debt is used by the rich nations and large institutions internationally.
Well, it's a well-known mechanism called debt trap diplomacy, whereby the countries of the global south are kept in perpetual debt, and this debt comes along with a huge interest rates. Borrowing money for the global north is cheap. It's actually a good deal for the US or the UK. You get almost 0% interest rates. But borrowing money for South Africa, Namibia, Argentina, the interest rates are much higher. And it's really a burden because you will never finish paying the loan because you're always paying the interest rates. And along with that, you're always forced to borrow even more money and to expand the fossil fuel frontier to actually be able to get the dollars that you need to pay this back. And along with that, the IMF and the World Bank, they tend to co-govern with you. So they impose austerity packages and restrictions, such as forcing governments to cut on social spending, retirement fund, privatize education, healthcare, and so on. And most importantly for the climate crisis, to push, as I was saying, the extractive industries that are destroying the planet.
Louise, I think what some people find very hard to understand is that the IMF and the World Bank, I mean, they're meant to govern on behalf of the world's people, aren't they? So why do they appear to be pushing poorer nations in such a disastrous direction?
Well, I think to begin with, it's an illusion that the IMF and the World Bank are supposed to be governed, or are supposed to govern for the poor nations. Their entire setup is completely colonial. There's an unspoken or unwritten rule that the heads of the IMF and the World Bank are shared between the US and Europe, basically. So it's very clear who has the say on where the money is going and who is allowed to lend money and borrow money for them. And they are absolutely not governing in the favor of the people. They are governing in the favor of their own interest and in their own profits, pushing extractivist industry and extractivist projects that are just keeping the material flows, but also the capital flows from south to north. So they are not governing for the people. They are governing for the 1%.
Now, Sonny, Louise mentioned colonial relationships there. And are we seeing a sort of form of colonialism being pursued even after supposedly the end of European imperialism?
The colonialist project is alive and well and totally entrenched in the DNA of the system. Colonialism continues to extract, continues to rape, continues to destroy, all in the name of progress and of development, but at its core, it's colonialism packaged as economic development. No, it's definitely very much a reality, and we fight the same burden. Today, we fight it on the financial front, and we fight it in the streets instead of how it was 120 years ago, 100 years ago, or even 50 years ago.
So you see the external debt that countries like yours must pay as a modern form of colonialism.
Absolutely, absolutely. Economic colonialism rife in our countries because it has the same DNA. The DNA was of traditional colonialism was to exercise power over the powerless. Today, that financial burden is exercising power over the powerless. So we experience it on a daily basis, and the global south, across the global south, the concern will be exactly the same.
For those who might not know the term, the global south means the previously colonized nations, doesn't it? The poorer nations of the world who continue to be exploited by richer nations.
Yes, you're right, George, and it also includes the indigenous nations, even if they reside traditionally in the north.
Sure. And Esteban, when you were talking earlier, you mentioned that the way in which this debt is leveraged to effectively force countries to stay with an extractivist economy, exploiting fossil fuels and other forms of extraction. Is that also part of the colonial project? Is that part of the wealth transfer that we've been talking about?
Yeah, and it's not only part of the colonial project, but it's also, and this is why this campaign is so important, it's also part of the suicidal path that the global north is leading us into, and that which, by connecting debt and climate, we can break out of.
Yes, well, we'll be coming to that in a moment. You can explain it when I come back to you in just a minute. But before we go there, to what extent are people in countries like yours, Argentina, countries like Sunny's also, but many other countries around the world, Esteban, to what extent are people aware of the debt as a form of oppression?
Well, this is a really good question for Argentina. Argentina is an emblematic example of the consequences of the IMF and its austerity policies. 20 years ago, we became an example to the world in 2001 when we kicked the IMF out of the country and the president had to flee on a helicopter after following mass protests that I was part of when I was 16 years old in Buenos Aires. And now, 20 years later, we are back in the grips of the IMF with the biggest loan ever awarded in its history, which was awarded in an illegitimate way, breaking its own statute to actually help right-wing President Macri win a re-election a few years ago, which even with that, he failed. Most of that money, as soon as it came in, about $44 billion, as soon as it came in, it escaped out of the country through financial schemes that had nothing to do with benefiting the public. So now Argentina is in so much debt and so much poverty resulting from the debt that is outrageous. And the new so-called progressive government, unfortunately, instead of auditing the debt and going against it, is actually signed a new deal with the IMF to legitimize the old debt and actually get into more loans to pay back the interest on the old ones. So right now, the burden of debt in Argentina, this is the biggest topic for Argentina, for the population in Argentina and much of the global south. And that's why this is such a neuralgic topic for the workers and for the poorest people of the world.
Yeah. Can I just ask very quickly, why has the new government not tried to abandon that odious debt, which was arranged by Macri?
Well, this is a question that all of us are wondering. And, you know, these governments are not angels. There's always a lot of corruption. There's always a lot of conflicts of interest. And there's always a lot of power at stake that they have to compromise to get something else they want. So we are really ashamed of that, and we need to fight it from within as much as we need to support those struggles from without, from the centers of power of Europe and the global north.
Okay, so now we've talked about financial debt, but there's another form of debt, Louise, isn't there, which is also incredibly powerful and needs to be brought to the front of people's minds, which is climate debt. Can you explain what climate debt is?
Sure. So what we are saying is that the global north has not only a climate debt, but also an ecological debt towards the global south, because all of our wealth that we are enjoying to these days is based on colonial extractivism from the past. So the reason why we're in this mess is because the global north and the rich classes of the world have exploited countries of the global south. This is what we are calling an ecological or the climate debt of the global north, which is related to, but not related to the financial debt of the global south, which can be cancelled, so that the global north can start to pay its own historic debt, for which it's responsible to bring us into this mess.
So before we get to that point, can you just lay out, in terms of the impacts of our greenhouse gases that we've produced in the rich nations, what the effect of those is on the poor nations? Because that's a large part of what we understand by the term climate debt, isn't it?
Well, if I may answer this question a little bit differently, because I think it's a huge problem in the climate movement and also in climate sciences that we are reducing the climate problem to CO2 emissions or methane emissions, even though they are very important and the impacts of global heating are very differently distributed. Especially people in the global south, especially poor people, are impacted most by the impacts of climate change. I think it's very important that we stop talking about climate change just in terms of emissions and come back to the roots of climate change, which is extractivism, which is happening in rural communities, in poor communities, in indigenous territories. And we need to stop, and we need to start talking again about the roots of the climate crisis and not just of the symptoms of the climate crisis if we want to have a more holistic image of the climate crisis.
I completely accept that point, but it is also true, isn't it, that the great majority of greenhouse gases have been produced by a small number of nations, generally, which are the rich nations, and that the majority of their impacts have been visited upon the poor nations. So there's a primary issue of injustice here.
Yes, for sure. That is the ecological, also the ecological or the climate debt that you were talking about, that the rich nations, but not only their governments and the nations basically, but especially also the multinational corporations that are governed by them or that they govern, the governments that they govern, so to say, are responsible for the destruction of livelihoods and for the emissions, of course. So it's not just governments, but we have to talk about multinational corporations in that as well.
Great. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for laying out the background so clearly. Now we come to the big idea. So, Esteban, can you tell us what Debt for Climate is and what it intends to do?
Sure. So after realizing that besides many of our frontline struggles that we connected with Sunny and our comrades from around the world in the global south, in Asia, Africa, Latin America, the indigenous peoples in the global north, we started to find that, we're fighting fracking, we're fighting mega mining, we're fighting deforestation, we are for many different frontline struggles. But there is a common denominator that is a ladder higher that could allow us to bring together a much larger coalition of forces than what we have been able to bring together specifically against fracking, against gas, against oil, or so on. And this is where debt comes in. The world, the global south, as we just described, is in a huge debt crisis that is looming. Sri Lanka is the tip of the iceberg for what is coming. The pandemic forced the global south countries to borrow even more beyond their means, and the food inflation, the crisis following the war in Ukraine is only going to tip things over the edge. So we are really at the doorsteps of a major global debt crisis that will begin in the global south. And this renders all of the global south nations unable to fulfill any climate goals and force them, as we said, to continue extracting fossil fuels and minerals and anything that the global north needs from them. So we realize that we have the climate crisis, you have the debt crisis, you have the climate debt from the global north, and the financial debt that the global south owes to the north that is mostly illegitimate. So we need to start to cancel them off. We need to start making and holding the global north accountable for its climate debt by demanding the immediate cancellation of the debt of the global south, to turn some of that debt into climate action and free the money so that these countries of the most impoverished nations could actually afford to leave fossil fuels underground and afford to have a just transition on time. And this is the only way that we have found a weak link in the system to make a quick and reasonable transition that will only come from the bottom up and from the grassroots, affecting pressure on the governments and on the centers of powers of Europe, such as the G7, which is where we are mobilizing next week all over the world.
So do you see this cancellation of the financial debt as part of the climate reparations that the rich nations owe to the poorer ones?
So there is a demand for reparations that is running on a parallel lane to the financial debt and the climate debt that we are discussing right now, and which the Debt for Climate campaign is also embracing and supporting. There is demands for reparations from slavery and colonialism that need to be paid, for loss and damage that needs to be paid, and the Debt for Climate, when we're talking about the financial debts, is mostly to begin begin by canceling off the debt that is really easily quantifiable. Like, in the case of Argentina, the IMF loan was $44 billion. So it's not difficult to name it and to quantify it and to say, well, we need this debt to be canceled off to even have any remote chance at fulfilling any climate goals and actually begin to make progress in the climate fight.
And Sonny, in a country like South Africa, how will that proposal play, do you think? What effect will it have on both environmental activists and working people's activists in South Africa?
So that's fundamentally important. We need to popularize the call to action. South Africa, the union movements have their own struggles. We fight the effects of the apartheid regime still on a daily basis. So the call to cancel the debt will play out in a very, very real and fundamental way. We need to link it to the rights and to the call of action of workers. We need to take this message directly to the workers. We need to make sure that workers understand that this call to cancel the debt will directly make the link to better wages, the creation of green jobs, and to be able to fund the just transition. It's an uphill battle. Because we have so many intersectional fights going on in the country at the moment, which I suppose will be the same in the global south. But this idea of making the call to action of cancelling the debt real and fundamental on the ground and in the streets, it's easy to make that connection because environmentalists, climate justice activists understand it. And fundamentally what the Debt for Climate campaign seeks to do is to put justice into climate justice. It's been missing for a long time. We talk about the climate crisis. We don't talk about climate justice. We want to embody climate justice. And we think that, as Esteban so profoundly always says, it's the weak link. And to make that connection, our challenge and our work on a daily basis as we grow this movement that's still in its infancy is to make sure that call is, to use social media terminology, is viral.
And this is why it's so important, Sonny, isn't it, that the leadership comes from the global south rather than from people like me in countries like the UK?
Absolutely fundamental to the success of this campaign is to make sure that it is understood that it's a global south-led initiative in partnership with the global north. We can only have authenticity. It can only be an authentic call if the global north, if the people in power, and if it acknowledges that this is a call from the global south. We are finding our feet. We are finding our voice. We are also becoming bold in our demands. And that's only authentic if activists, organizations, civil society in the global south, in the global north, recognizes that. And we must constantly drive home that point.
Louise, as Sonny was saying, that doesn't mean there isn't a role for activists in the global north in solidarity with people in the global south. Could you spell out what that role is?
Yeah, I think there are different roles in it. We can take on different roles. I think one big first step is education, to educate ourselves about the role that we play in this, and our countries and our governments play in this. This is something that we observe a lot in the global north, especially in the climate movements, that when we present the campaign, people say like, oh, this is a brilliant idea, but I don't really get it. Like, what is this debt and how is that related to it? And what is the IMF? What is the World Bank? So it is really an opportunity for the movements and for people living in these countries to really educate themselves about their role, about the government's role, also in the decision-making processes of the IMF and the World Bank, and thus to also find the bottlenecks in a way in their own countries of where to hit and how to place the demands. It's of course also a way of supporting the actions, of visibilizing it, so making the statements visible, doing a lot of background work, such as social media work on preparing press releases that are then written, of course, by the leading figures of the global south, and then that are distributed, for example, by people of the global north. So it is like background work, and then calling it out, but getting together also to fight together, organizing their own actions, and spreading the word here as well, so that we can really learn and tackle learn about the roots of the climate crisis again, and really rooting it in that sense.
And staying with you for a moment, Louise, do you think that activists in the global north are ready for to sort of step back and allow the global south to lead?
That highly depends on the individuals, I say. I think there are a lot of good groups and a lot of good people who are ready to do it, who don't really know how to yet. There, in some cases, there's like a hyper awarenessness that leads to inaction, basically. That people are just shutting down, and are not doing anything anymore, which is a really problematic result of their own education in a way. But they're making themselves ready, and I think like people like Esteban, for example, who has his feet in both worlds, if you want to divide it like that, can really, or is really helping people in the global north to come out of this inaction. And to find their place in it. And I think people are really, it's a lot of empowerment actually as well, for people to know that they are together on the streets with other countries, with other people at the same time, so that they know that they are not divided anymore, and really working and protesting and taking action together with other people. So I think that is really essential. And I think for that, we are more than ready. We're more than ready to not be alone anymore.
Yeah. Esteban, the sort of global launch of Debt for Climate is taking place at the G7 summit in Germany. What sort of response do you expect to get from the governments assembled there?
Well, yes, the G7 is when we give birth on the streets to this movement that we have been building for over the past half a year, with a lot of meetings and calls between labor and climate and social movements around the world. The response that we expect is not necessarily an immediate response of support or anything like that. We know that we are going after the biggest powers of the world. We know that we are mobilizing an unprecedented level of forces and breadth and scope of movements against a tiny minority of the world that controls most of us and our fate, and is leading us into the climate crisis and into the catastrophic future that we are facing. So we also know that they have their tentacles deep into a lot of institutions and media, and my personal history is one small example of what happens when you confront power. The weaponized justice system to create criminal cases against you, the media operations to defame you, and everything else that they have. So we can expect that this movement, if it is to be truly revolutionary, it will encounter nothing but a lot of resistance and defamation and trolls, and power will fight back as we are going to confront it. But we are ready for that. We know we're fighting for our survival. We know that we need to come together, and that we have arrived at this place in history and time by being divided, by being isolated, by being nationalistic, and that a global climate crisis demands a global resistance that must be united, and that this is the only way forward that we could achieve anything connecting global south and north.
Sunny, explain what the trajectory might look like. So the sort of big visible launch is taking place at the G7 summit. Where's it going to go from there? And how will this turn into a movement big enough and powerful enough to achieve its aims?
Oh, absolutely. So the G7 is just the curtain raiser, if you were. After that, we start to build momentum as we build towards COP27 in Egypt. In between G7 and COP27 is building, interacting, consolidating support across all spheres of society. We know that this campaign is a multi-year campaign. The trajectory obviously must gain momentum as we bring other organizations on board. Specifically, the biggest chunk is the worker movement. We build that, but we aim for COP27. We aim to make debt for climate a mechanism that is negotiated and that is discussed, and our work is cut out for us in the sense that it will be a hard ask at COP27 if we take previous COPs as a example, the history, and even the meeting in Bonn over the last week. So the challenge is to build on the momentum towards COP27, but recognizing that it's a multi-year program as it's decentralized, as countries start to develop how the mechanism will play out in their own regions.
I mean, there is a fundamental problem here, isn't it, Louise, in that you're having to appeal to the very institutions which are least likely to hear you. And we've seen how even at the climate summits, the COP meetings, the powerful nations have dominated, even though it's meant to be a meeting of equals, and they huddle together and make the decisions and shut everybody else out. And part of the result of that is that they refuse to contemplate the idea of reparations for the loss and damage caused by climate breakdown in the poorer nations. How do we break through that impasse?
Well, I think the point that Sunny was making is really important for this. That means also building the power on the streets, building the power from below. This is not. We have gone through a period of extreme individualization and particularization that we have to counteract first and foremost, because as just small groups, one group's doing an action here and another one there, completely uncoordinated, will not lead to anything. But if we start to actually organizing on an international, transnational, global level, as we are on the way to do, this changes a lot. And especially if we hit them where it hurts, and if they start to see that we are behind them and biting them in their back by targeting the right things, but then also by building up the masses who can really shut down a country. You can see that at the moment in the case of Sri Lanka. They have a blockade holding up for, I think it's like 60 or 70 days now, and they're not going anywhere until they get what they need. And this is an example that we can definitely learn from. And if we start to get serious and also believing in the movements that we are building, that we can actually achieve this, our tactics are going to change dramatically as well. And while we do that, I'm really building this power and this the power and the empowerment that we need to get serious, I think then it's going to change. And then they are going to be forced to listen, because we're not going anywhere until, and we're just shutting everything down until we have what we want.
So we're coming towards the end of the program now. So to finish us off, Esteban, can you tell me what the world will look like in, say, 5 years' time if your campaign has succeeded?
Well, if the campaign succeeds, and this is definitely what we're working for right now, will be the eradication of the IMF and the World Bank, a radical transformation of the financial system, and the liberation and emancipation of the most important form of neo-colonialism that has kept the Global South in underdevelopment and as a producer of raw materials for the rich world, which is loans, which is debt. To go directly at the core of colonialism of the 21st and 20th century, to eradicate that, emancipate our countries from the Global South from this burden, and allow for a just transition to be financed with the money that wouldn't need to be paid anymore to this usury institution that were created with the sole intent to keep us under domination, and that climate justice and social justice will be united, that the workers of the world will unite, with the climate activists of the world will unite, that we will not allow to be divided like the people behind the Brexit are also trying to do, to divide the working class from the climate activists. We are building an alternative to say that we can come together, that we have a common agenda, and that together, united globally, we can bring down the top 1% and create a healthy and sustainable future for everyone.
Thank you very much. Esteban Servat, Sunny Morgan, Louise Wagner, that's been a really fascinating discussion. And I have to say, it fills me with hope. You know, it does show that I think we have a way forward when often things were looking pretty bleak. So thank you very much, and good luck with the launch of the campaign at the G7.
Thank you so much, George.
Thank you, George, for having us.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much for having us.
Thank you.